Welcome to Research Renaissance, presented by the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. We invite you into the stories, struggles, and breakthroughs shaping the future of human health. From cutting-edge brain science to discoveries transforming how we heal, adapt, and thrive. We explore the ideas that matter and the people behind them. Together, we look across diseases, technology, and research fields to understand not just what is changing, but why it matters for patients, families, and the future we all share. Join us as we uncover new insights, spark collaboration, and illuminate the science that can improve our lives. So welcome to Research Renaissance. I'm Deborah Westphal, your host and guide through the fascinating future of health science. Joining me today is Dr. Jacob Hooker, a neuroscientist and entrepreneur who founded and is now leading Sensorium Therapeutics, where he is developing new treatments for mental health disorders inspired by brain chemistry and natural components. So welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
Yeah, you've got a really unique journey. You trained as a chemist.
Indeed.
And you became a neuroscientist, and now you founded a biotech company. What first inspired you to really kind of turn this research into new treatments, especially in the area of mental health?
Yeah, I'll go back a little ways in my educational history just to give you a sense of the twists and turns. I think some of the audience might be interested in this. I've always been very application oriented. I want to see like the tangible outcome of any of my effort. And when I was thinking about my undergraduate education, which I got at NC State, I was choosing a major based on how I could think about the application of it. I ended up in textile chemistry, which many people don't even know what textile chemistry is, or maybe don't even think about textiles that often. But textiles are very kind of application oriented in that way. You can think about polymers and how those polymers at the microscopic or atomic scale ultimately kind of propagate to a material that you might wear, a material that might help you stay protected from the rain. So I was drawn to this connection between basic science and application very, very early, and that followed every twist and turn. Every time I had a chance to reinvent myself, that was a guiding principle. Was always about how do I connect the science I do to impact. I didn't know what that was for quite some time. Like, how do you actually have impact? And I'm still learning how to do that. But I have learned that there's so many different barriers that you can overcome if you're just willing to reinvent and learn.
Yeah. So tell us about your company, because that is kind of that pivot point. How long have you been doing it? What was the startup and kind of today's focus?
Yeah, today I run Sensorium Therapeutics, biotech company here in the Boston area. We're focused on the treatment of mental health disorders and adjacent neurological disease. Our lead program is in anxiety, and we really chose anxiety as the lead indication for a couple of reasons. One, anxiety affects everyone. It resonates with everyone. Everyone understands what anxiety is. But I think people underappreciate how hard anxiety manifestation can be for a lot of people. This is a kind of stark statistic. Nearly 20% of the U.S. population is formally diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. That's a lot, right? 1/5 of the U.S. population has a diagnosis, and yet we don't really have great treatments. Sometimes, people benefit from cognitive behavioral therapy. Sometimes there are medications that can help. But we really don't have, tremendously efficacious, and effective strategies to treat anxiety. So we went after that initially, and then we've expanded a pipeline to include now epilepsy with co-occurring anxiety and a younger program now in cognitive enhancement, which of course can be positioned in both mental illness or mental health, and of course neurological disorders like neurodegeneration. So Sensorium takes a unique approach. We go back to where most actually CNS drugs come from. 85% of all medicines for the brain that have been approved by the FDA can be traced back to an observation in nature. And yet, science has moved a little bit away from that, and we're kind of going back to it with a fresh twist using kind of modern computational tools.
So explain that a little bit, getting back to, that observation in nature, observation of patients, observation of chemistry. What does that mean?
Yeah, I'll give an example to help people kind of contextualize how you go from nature to a drug. And I'll give one of the most recent approvals in psychiatric medicine, the approval of a drug now called Cobenfy, which is a Bristol Myers Squibb drug that was bought from a company called Karuna Therapeutics for $14 billion about a year and a half ago. If you look at the history of that drug, Cobenfy, it's got an active molecule in it called xanolamine. And the origin of that molecule actually goes all the way back to an observation of psychoactive nuts, these so-called betel nuts that are chewed in Southeast Asia. They create kind of red sputum, red spit, and the sidewalks of the streets are in fact red from people, chewing this psychoactive nut. So oftentimes we find some unique molecule that changes the human brain experience, how people perceive the world, maybe a change in mood state, maybe just some hard to describe psychoactivity in nature. And often that tells us something about a novel mechanism, some new way of engaging with the human brain that's different than how we've positioned current drugs to do that. And if you chase those deeply enough, if you really go deeply enough to understand the mechanism of action, how they engage with the human brain, you can then start to matchmake those to our Western construct of psychiatry. How could that mechanism relate to anxiety or depression or bipolar disorder? And it's that connection between the mechanism of action and our kind of understanding of disease biology that helps us then make decisions about how to develop these molecules into a drug.
So what was that turning point when you decided that the world needed a sensorium, company, that there was a need, or was there a desire? Was it the fact that, you were looking at the direction of the existing pharmaceutical companies, or were you looking at where the knowledge of the brain and it was kind of accelerating or, gaining impact? What was that kind of that moment or that time frame where you're like, no, the world needs us to do this?
It's a great question. There's this common refrain in drug development that developing drugs for the central nervous system, the brain, is hard. And I think that's true. Failure in brain drug development is high. And I think that's caused big pharmaceutical companies to come in and out of it, right? There was a kind of heyday in the development of early psychiatric drugs through the, 70s, 80s, and even, 90s. And then I think we spent about a decade or two kind of changing strategies in neuropsychiatry where, this was at the cusp of the genetic revolution. We learned a lot about gene associations and mental illness, and those became really exciting, opportunities to chase, new target biology. But a lot of that was very difficult to translate. Very few of the genetically associated targets have yet made it to the drug landscape. I think that there's still a lot of hope there. But one of the challenges is even if you know the gene that may be dysfunctional or even the protein that's encoded by that gene, it's really hard to know exactly how to modulate it. Like, do I want to increase its function? Do I want to decrease its function? Is it synergistic with other areas of biology that also have to move simultaneously to get efficacy? And many of the genetics observations in mental health or psychiatric disorders are what are known as common allele variants. A lot of people have these variants and have no manifest disease, right? I might be carrying all sorts of genetic associations with mental health conditions. That doesn't mean I'm going to get it. They're not deterministic. So I think for me, it was the recognition that we had moved away from a strategy that had worked pretty well, right? Human first observation, how do molecules engage and change human experience, was kind of disconnected from how we were thinking about a genetics forward approach. And then when we launched Sensorium, it was actually out of kind of the resurgence of interest in psychedelic research. My co-founders were Jerry Rosenbaum, the former chief of psychiatrist at Mass General Hospital, and Stephen Haggerty, who's an amazing chemical neuroscientist at Harvard and Mass General. And we were thinking a lot about psychedelics and how to understand the neurobiology and position those, in the best possible way for therapeutic benefit. And it just turns out we kept bumping into really interesting molecules that weren't hallucinogenic, and we wanted to chase those. We thought they had tremendous therapeutic potential, and that led to the genesis of Sensorium.
Yeah. You said something that I thought was really interesting, because I wonder, when you're talking to people, especially around, mental illness, anxiety, I think there's still a very common notion that it's just feelings. They're just feelings,
Right.
It's just,
Right.
it's an environment, or, it's stress, or you just can't handle. But what you said was this reverse, it is genetic. There is something that is going on in our brain. And then how do you match the kind of this new view of chemistry? Do you find that this is something, when you're out talking to people and investors and such, that there's this educational component to what you're trying to do?
Huge component. So you're pointing right to a big problem that we still have, although we've gotten better in the U.S. at least with the stigma around mental health. For a long time, you didn't talk about whether you had depression, right? Depression was like, oh, just pick yourself up. You need to put on your rosy colored glasses and live a different world, right? Or like you said, anxiety. Well, come on, we're all stressed out. That's just life, right? There's a difference when a feeling converts to something that's disabling, right? That's when it becomes, really a psychiatric disorder, when it, prevents you from having meaningful social engagement, when you might avoid a doctor and not get proper care, when you might not go to work just because you're anxious for the interaction with your peers, right? So, it comes down to the intersection of the way we feel and how it affects the quality of our lives. And I would say it's not too unlike the stigma that you see in other areas. I think we've made huge progress in the stigma around obesity, largely because you can now see just how powerful these GLP-1 drugs are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's helping people understand that, in fact, it's not just because someone didn't have control of their appetite and overate. In fact, like, we can modulate the chemistry of the human body and have profound changes. Well, that means fundamentally, like, if that's true, the reverse is also true, that the innate chemistry of our bodies can also dictate the outcome, right? That these are encoded. They're not choices.
Yeah.
These are not choices. One of the biggest areas that you mentioned, investors, we end up talking a lot about social anxiety disorder, which turns out is the largest single anxiety disorder diagnosed in the U.S.
I didn't know
seven
there was different anxiety
different kinds.
disorders.
There's social anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorders, and then there's the adjacent ones like obsessive compulsive disorder, which obviously has a lot of anxiety features. There's even autism, I would say, is synonymous in many ways with social anxiety. But social anxiety disorder has this, terrible name because it makes it feel like it's just shyness. Oh, well, you don't like to go out, and socialize. Well, it's actually really, really debilitating. And there just really aren't great treatments. And we have had to do a fair bit of education around the prevalence, just how big of a problem social anxiety disorder is, and why we need treatments for it, for example.
Yeah.
the U.S. has come a long way. I would say from a stigma perspective, we're moving the needle, whereas, other countries are not, particularly, some Asian countries still really kind of hide and mask psychiatric illness.
Yeah. So you talked about this kind of this natural occurring or getting back to nature.
Yeah.
I had a conversation with a researcher that a long time ago they found this, this amazing drug that did some things, or this amazing plant that did some things to the locals, and she wanted to publish on it, and she thought it might be a good therapeutic.
Yeah.
But the kind of the pushback was, but you can't patent that chemistry if it's
Right.
in nature. So, what's that conflict that because you're building your platform, your foundation
Yeah.
on these things. Like, what does that
Yeah.
look like for you as a company?
Yeah. Super, super insightful, and you're spot on. You can't patent any observation of nature whatsoever, whether it's a molecule, a protein, or otherwise. While nature gives us tremendous pharmacology, nature didn't design drugs, right? Nature didn't recognize that the preferred method of human consumption would be an oral pill once a day, right? We have so standardized that concept that when you look at the practice of what we call ethnobotany, the use of, the human use of plants for things like medicine, oftentimes there's fairly elaborate preparations. For example, tinctures and teas, you have to hold it in your mouth. You can't swallow it. Topical ointments instead of oral solutions. Those observations give us hints about what the molecule is doing, how it's getting into the system to do, to have its medical or, activity effect, if you will. And oftentimes we have to make derivatives of those molecules in order to make them approachable from a once a pill kind of day, a day kind of strategy. So we end up making chemical derivatives. We isolate the natural compound or compounds that have the right pharmacology. They hit the right targets in the human brain, but maybe they have terrible metabolic fate. Maybe they are eliminated from the system too fast, and you would have to take, have to take them too often per day. So we end up doing a lot of novel chemistry around these natural products to make them drug-like, and then it's that intellectual property that gets the protection to move forward as a company.
So it's the process. It's the process of that you're taking this chemistry, and then you're kind of re-engineering it for, like you said, for human consumption.
Yeah, we make new molecules that are inspired. We say we're nature inspired.
Yeah.
Nature tells us how to engage with the system, and we end up making derivatives of the molecule that enhance their efficacy.
So how do you stay kind of current then because there's other folks that are looking at different kind of mechanisms to get through the blood-brain barrier, or they're studying the vagus nerve to see if there's, that could be a delivery system. How are you, because you get your core business around these nature-inspired chemistry, but there's a lot of science that's going on, just understanding how our body functions. Like, how do you keeping up with that?
Yeah. One thing to recognize is I don't see Sensorium in competition with any mental health company. And that may sound strange, because, in fact, superficially we are. But the unmet need in psychiatry is so large that there can be 20 or 30 or 50 companies that are successful, and we still will not have addressed the unmet need. So we pay a lot of attention to it, so that we can learn from how others are having success, and we can apply that to our pipeline. But I often, get the question about, the competitive landscape, and I really just don't even feel that sense of competition because the problem is so big. One thing we do a lot of is retrain methods that become natural product specific. For example, there are really interesting algorithms to make predictions about whether or not a molecule will cross the blood-brain barrier. But those algorithms were trained on, synthetic libraries of drugs that or drug-like molecules that have been made for many, many decades. And they weren't trained very well, or they were underrepresented in their training sets from natural products. So we often will take strategies that have worked very, very effectively in other areas of drug development and then reapply them conceptually to the natural product space and develop kind of proprietary methods that help us make decisions. And then otherwise, we're very, I guess, hopeful that it will be the combination of things. I don't think that we have to think about, cognitive behavioral therapy and the improvements that people are making there as being distinct or separate from better medicines, small molecule drugs. I think people can benefit from both, and it really will become personal preference, heterogeneity of response. Some people will respond better to certain types of therapies. And the hope I have for the future is that we do a better job of being able to predict who would respond to something. Because I've seen firsthand the empiricism of, all of medicine, but particularly psychiatry, where you're given a prescription to try something, and then we'll come back in 3 to 6 months and we'll see if it's working, and then it's not, or it made things worse, and then you readjust, and you do that for years before you might land on the efficacious, the molecule that helps you. So I'm hopeful that we can figure out how to not only develop new medicines but make predictions about who is best suited for those medicines.
Is that kind of why you have recently moved to these discoveries, kind of from the lab to more clinical, individuals and people? Is that why you're trying to do that? And what does that kind of look like as you go through this?
I come from a molecular imaging background. So I was trained as a chemist, as you mentioned earlier, became fascinated by the brain, actually in addiction neurobiology. I went to Brookhaven National Laboratory and studied with some really, really amazing people there. And I learned how you take a molecule that you've thought about constructing from first principles, right, at the lab bench, where you're literally making a molecule for the first time. I learned how to think from that step all the way through, how do I get that molecule in the human for the purpose of visualizing the chemistry of the human brain, with the thought that if I can start to image the same types of protein targets in the brain that are used for therapeutics, I might be able to help understand who is a better candidate for one drug or another. And so I spent, 16 years in my academic career developing ways to image the human brain that no one else had, pursued yet, really to try and stratify and think about differential biology that would define maybe subtypes of schizophrenia or, different etiologies of Lou Gehrig's disease, or, all sorts of things we've gone after, looking at inflammatory signatures in autism, with, again, the hope that it's the marriage of those biomarker or imaging, imaging is one of many biomarker strategies, but I think a powerful one. The marriage of those biomarker strategies ultimately with therapeutic intervention, that we can make predictions about who should be on the right, a particular treatment for them.
So that's a dual area that you're advancing inside your company, is the imagery side, this biomarker, to be able to select people to match up to the therapeutics that you're developing. Did I understand that correctly?
At Sensorium, we're leveraging what we know works from a biomarker perspective right now. We're not currently developing novel ones at Sensorium, but for example, we're currently running our phase 1 clinical trial for our anxiolytic, development candidate. This, clinical candidate that we've put forward into people. It's a safety study, pharmacokinetic study, but we're using EEG. Every participant that goes into that study, we put a cap on them with, 20 some odd electrodes and, a couple of, heart rate variability monitors. And we're trying to understand more precisely the timing and action of the drug as it relates to the circuitry of the human brain, which will teach us a lot more about which types of patients might most benefit. And then the hope is in later clinical trials, we'll be able to develop a strategy that might, have some pre-measurement criteria that would make some predictions about who would best respond. I mean, it's pretty early days because we're just starting to get some of those signals from our first clinical trial. But there have been some pretty good successes in the field. There's in fact a company called Alto Neuroscience out of Stanford that's been pretty successful at taking signals like EEG and being able to stratify who is most likely to benefit from this antidepressant versus, say, this antidepressant. And I think that field's going to evolve very rapidly in the next few years, and we're going to hope to pull those together with our new therapeutic strategies.
Yeah, that's huge, because I know, I have family members that have gone through, 3-4 painful years of trying to get the right balance of drugs. If something happens in their life and it goes a little wacky, now you're back to the next 3 or 4 years of trying to find that balance, not only of the drug, but the amount and the frequency of it. That's a lot of pain, additional pain that people go through.
On top of that challenge, when you have success, right? You've got a patient that was ill, profoundly ill, went 3 years on a journey to be successfully treated. After a year or so of successful treatment, people feel better and they start to question, do I still need this drug? And so it's very, very common that patients will discontinue thinking, it's a solved problem, and they'll go right back into that spiral of whatever their illness is. And it's not necessarily the case that starting that same drug again, will give them the same benefit. So we have a really limited understanding of kind of the chronic manipulation of medicines on the brain and how to successfully then change treatment later, wean people off successfully, or after they've stopped a drug and it's no longer working, how to restart and get back to that level of efficacy. So that's like an area we really haven't touched. I mean, we've been so focused on just finding treatments to get to people. We haven't really thought about the chronic treatment problems nearly as much.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. And I just, with the brain able to sometimes rewire or repair, or it's just, you may be dealing with a new brain.
Right.
If you go off the, I'm curious your perspective, and I'm sure there's no quantifiable way, but you talked about the massive need that's out there, and that you really don't think about the competitive landscape because you're all working, trying to solve these things. Is the need growing because there's something that's happening with modern life or in our environment? Or is it just an awareness now? You mentioned that we're getting better at talking about things and bringing that up. What's your kind of gut feel? Is it more the need is there because we're just being freer with the awareness and speaking about it? Or do you think there's just something in our daily lives that are kind of getting us off track?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I will bite. I will give you some thoughts on this. Not necessarily strongly supported by data. The human brain, I think people maybe underappreciate that its fundamental function is to make predictions. So we get so much sensory information. You've got, your eyes, ears, nose, your hands feeling things. You're getting all of that sensory information coming into you in this massive stream. So much so that it's not that we can't actively process it all. So what we're constantly doing is making predictions that, my visual field is stable. And so you're not using as much energy. Your kind of brain is approximating stability. But then you're really good when you see deviation, right? You see something shoot through and run in your periphery, and you can immediately recognize it. So our brains are wired for deviation from prediction. But there's a really big metabolic cost to that. It takes a lot of energy to be a prediction machine. But it's a really efficient way to make sure you don't get eaten by a lion, right? It's like a really efficient way from that perspective, from an evolutionary perspective. So when the world is stable, if you think in evolutionary history perspective, one might argue life was more stable outside of these kind of, really acute, dangerous situations you might find yourself in. I would say that modern life, particularly, in the U.S. right now, but lots of places, is the extreme of unpredictable. And I do think there's a strong connection between predictability and obviously disorders like anxiety. So I think it's not just a growing awareness. I think there's an increase. And if you look, epidemiologically across different geographies, it's very interesting. I mentioned 20% of the U.S. population has an anxiety disorder. Something like 15%, I think, in Canada, and I think, interesting, like 10% in Australia. And I've always wondered, is there some way to, and probably people have done this, I should just go look, to associate this lack of predictability or the instability of a given, social setting or society with a manifestation of anxiety. But I think there are all sorts of other things that are that are pushing us toward an increase in mental health that is beyond just recognition.
Yeah. It's really interesting because modern day life, like you said, it's in even if you don't feel it's stressful, it is very busy. It's very noisy. You're bombarded with everything, and all the things you have to do just to participate in the daily activities. Yeah. I think it's interesting, and I'm kind of curious because you said you were very interested in chemistry. Just really early on, what got you kind of focused on the brain? Was there somebody in your family, or what was it? Because it's a lot of dedication to go through all the schooling that you went through and research. What was that moment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think a lot about it. I didn't set out to end up in mental health therapeutic development. But I chased opportunity, things that were exciting to me, things that I naturally would just dive into because they were interesting. But if I rewind, I mean, it does all, while I didn't set out to do it, it was encoded very early in childhood. I'm starting to more openly share this, so I'll share. My mother suffers from schizoaffective disorder. She had a psychotic break when I was quite young, and I lived through, what I would call challenging times, watching her and her, journey. Fortunately, she is in maybe the most stable condition she's been, but that wasn't always the case. And I think living that firsthand, it frustrated me. It frustrated me endlessly. And I think my shift to neuroscience was really serendipitous. It was at the end of graduate school. I was at UC Berkeley. I was working on imaging agents based on these viral capsids for drug delivery, something not neuroscience focused whatsoever. But I got invited to a conference on nuclear medicine, kind of an imaging field conference. And I happened to see a seminar by Joanna Fowler, who would later become my postdoctoral mentor. And her team had radio labeled cocaine. They had made a radioactive version of cocaine and had used that to study the regulation of the dopamine transporter in patients before and after, before and after addiction, or after addiction was noticed and relapse, and all of these really insightful neurobiological kind of insight, observations using a radioactive, psychoactive molecule. And I was fascinated. I couldn't imagine anything more exciting than being able to take a molecule, design it, radio label it, and then go study the human brain. Like, what an amazing power, right? Like a superpower. And so that set me down the path of neuroscience. And, I dove into that, starting with concepts around the environment and, could we measure the epigenetic influence of environmental insults on the brain? Could we look at inflammatory signals to really understand, disease biology? And I've just continued to keep pushing and pushing. The big shift for me was, probably 7 or 8 years ago, being an academic scientist, making observations wasn't enough. Being able to show people why, people with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or other diseases were different than kind of typical, controls, if you will, volunteers, wasn't enough. We would make these observations and then it felt like a big so what, right? I wasn't ready just to throw that knowledge over the fence through publication and hope that someone else picked it up to do something with it. I decided I needed to take action that would not just describe biology, but would intervene. And so I started making shifts quite some time ago, well before Sensorium started and well before I jumped in as CEO. But I started making that shift quite some time ago.
Yeah. But the founder journey in the business side is, it's a whole different tribe. It's got different behavior and language and different networks that you have to. What was you knew you had to make that pivot, but what were some of the big surprises of either how easy, or I would imagine it was really more on how hard that was?
Yeah. Easy and hard is a really interesting matter of perspective, right? I often, even in academia, faculty members would come up to me lamenting how hard it was to get a grant, right? It is hard to get a grant. And I would often say, in what other world can you write 12 pages of text and someone, maybe with a 10% success rate, people would say, well, that's really low. 10% chance with 12 pages of text that you would get $2.5 million to chase whatever idea you want to write down. So yeah, it's hard on one hand, but on the other hand, it's kind of remarkable and maybe easy, right? It really depends on your perspective.
Yeah.
Because not too many people have the chance to chase that scale of opportunity through a systemized path. So as you were asking the question, I immediately started thinking about my journey. I started my first company, Sensorium Therapeutics, about 7 years ago, and I had no idea what I was doing. No idea. I was fortunate that I had done some consulting and served on scientific advisory committees and things adjacent to and in biotech. So I'd picked up a little bit of network capacity and a little bit of the vernacular and vocabulary, and it is its own language. But I had to even, I started asking people, like, what should I be reading to learn about this space? And I remember, people were very generous in their time, but they were also generous with recommendations about, you're going to need to learn about venture capital. So you should buy this book, Venture Deals, and read it on the airplane because, it's about a 3 or 4 hour read and you'll learn so much from it. And it was just little bits along the way over many, many years. I picked up enough to have the confidence that I knew how to navigate the landscape when I finally made the decision to leave academia and jump in to biotech, head first. I would say the biggest surprise, I think, it's just honestly the generosity of people and opening up their networks to me. People in biotech, I think pharma gets a bad rap. Biotech, I think, very distinct from pharma, but both probably get this reputation that it's all profit driven. There are very few people that I've met and interact with that are doing this, solely for the profit motive, right? It almost always comes from a scientist trying to make a difference first. And yes, at the end of the day, it is an economic game. And if you want to be able to have investments of, tens and hundreds of millions of dollars into this space, someone at the end of the day has to get that risk recovered. But I've been really happy and pleasantly surprised with just how generous people are in helping companies launch, helping people like me learn to do what I do. It's been really good, really heartening.
Yeah. Tell us about the people that are in your company, the ones that are kind of on the day-to-day in Sensorium.
Yeah, we have a great team. It's a fun team. We're small. I mean, in Biotech, we operate as a virtual company, meaning, we do have office space, but we use a distributed network of, labs out there in the world, all across the globe. So our internal scientific team, thinks very hard about the steps we need to take forward, the biology, the development plan, and then we work with partners, contract manufacturers, brilliant chemists in India. So it's really fun, and that allows us to have very focused, individual experts, but diversity across the team. So we have computational biologists, we have now, amazing AI and LLM expertise internally. We have, drug hunters. We've got, physicians that, that are designing and leading the clinical studies. So it's, I think, an amazing team because of the breadth. I get the privilege of working with each of them, and on any given day, I could be down, some patient journey clinical rabbit hole, or the next day looking at the most amazing wizardry that's come out of, the latest, Claude Code LLM. I mean, for me, it's fantastic because I've never really been accused of focus in my life.
Yeah. That's amazing. That's really amazing. So when you look ahead and, 5, 10, 15, pick your time frame.
Yeah.
What is your greatest hope, especially in this area of this brain-based medicine that is informed, or inspired by nature?
Yeah. I have a singular concept of what impact looks like. And I'll describe it, and then it will seem small, and I'll tell you why it's not. If in, say, 10 years, 15, 20, whatever it takes me in my career, the time I have left, if I can have profound impact on one person and their family's life, I will have done exactly what I set out to do. And I focus on that one because I don't want to lose sight of the individual journey and how important it is to solve a problem for one person. And if I can do that, I pretty much guarantee I will help a lot of people. But I don't let myself dream about what could be on a scale other than getting to that first person that we make a profound impact in their life.
Yeah.
Like that is the focus.
That's amazing. That's amazing. You're amazing. I love the passion and the kind of that calm focus, because I do feel like you're a focused person. I really appreciate your perspective on easy and hard. I don't think there's not a lot of people that hold that, and I think that's very unique. Jacob, how would people, as we wrap up here, how would people, find you?
Yeah.
Where's the right person to talk to find out what you're doing, give you some money, maybe bring some new ideas?
Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity to share that. So pretty easy. If you Google Jacob Hooker, there are others out there, but fortunately I do seem to make, the Google search headlines. So if you Google me, you'll find email addresses, you'll find my LinkedIn profile. I've recently started a Substack where I write essays on things related to Sensorium, not exclusively Sensorium, but if you want to read some, kind of off the wall thought pieces, essays of sorts, I have a Substack called Ether in Mind, AETHER in Mind, .substack.com. But if you find me, you'll find my LinkedIn, which will get you the Substack. It's something new I've started. People should just feel free to reach out. I love informal communication. I'm pretty hyper responsive. People always worry I'm too busy for them. I'm not. I'm just a person that likes to engage. So folks should reach out. That would be fantastic.
Yeah. Well, I really, really appreciate your time today. I can't imagine how busy you are. And your story is wonderful. And I'm just rooting for all your success.
Thank you.
For those individuals. So it's your focus.
Well, thank you for providing a platform for people's voices to be heard. It's important.
Thank you for joining Research Renaissance. For more information and to stay updated, subscribe for more episodes and visit our website at tofflertrust.org. Feel free to call us if you have any thoughts, suggestions, or just want to find out more about the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Until we meet again, onward and upward.